unquote. So we pray, loving God of one family, we come this evening to learn more about the impact of climate change on refugees and the issues in our American immigration system. Help us, Lord, understand and respond to all of those who, for various reasons, are forced to live far from their homeland, to seek safety far from their homeland, and be separated from their families. Help us realize our integral relationship with Earth, our common home. And may we realize that Earth is a collective good and the patrimony of all humanity and the responsibility of everyone. Give us courage to enact change which will illuminate the dignity of our immigrant brothers and sisters. And Lord, we thank you for Sarah being with us this evening, and we pray, amen, may it be so.
Thank you, Sister Anita. Throughout Sarah's talk, I do ask that everybody keep themselves muted. If you have questions, I would ask you to put them in the chat. If you don't know what the chat is, at the bottom of your Zoom screen is the word chat. When you click on that, at least on my screen, it's on the right-hand side, you will see a chat box at the bottom of that screen where it says type message here. So if you type your questions in there, at the end of Sarah's talk, I will then feed those questions to Sarah to answer. We are recording tonight so that we can share this afterwards with those who unfortunately were not able to get on, or they forgot, or whatever. So we are recording this talk tonight. Thank you. Well, we welcome Sarah Owings, an immigration attorney and advocate, to discuss how climate change and its root causes have affected the lives of people seeking protection through the U.S. immigration system. She will share her experience representing migrants in the asylum proceedings and explain the current legal landscape for climate refugees and her thoughts on what can be done to address the emerging problem. Sarah is a partner at Owings McNorland LLC in Atlanta, Georgia. She earned her Juris Doctor degree from the College of Law at Georgia State University in 2007. And she has practiced immigration law exclusively since that time. Sarah has experience in removal defense, family-based immigration, humanitarian forms of relief, and asylum proceedings. Sarah has volunteered as a pro bono attorney in numerous asylum cases, and she has worked collectively with attorneys, organizers, and advocates to address emerging issues that affect migrants, including the closure of the southern border to asylum seekers, the rapid expansion of for-profit civil detention centers, the deplorable conditions of migrant detention, and disparate outcomes in asylum proceedings throughout the United States. She is frequently asked to speak at continuing legal education programs and to provide commentary to the media on the rapidly changing immigration landscape. In 2017, Sarah was elected to the Board of Governors of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and she currently serves that board as an elected director. Sarah is a past board member of the Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network and is currently a board member of Immigrants List, a PAC dedicated to reforming our broken immigration system, stopping anti-immigrant policies, and electing pro-reform candidates to office. I've known Sarah for a while. Sarah is a graduate of St. Frederick High School in Monroe, Louisiana, when I taught down there. And I've seen her on Facebook, and she does share sometimes on Facebook some of the results of some of her cases. And that's what got me interested in asking Sarah to be a speaker for our FFE series. And she graciously agreed to do so. So I asked Sarah to present, and welcome Sarah to our Franciscans for Earth speaker series.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciated the invitation, Sister Cheryl, and it's really great to be here. I hope that I haven't disappointed you, since you were one of my early, educators in my formative years, and it's really appreciated that you would come to me for this question that you have about what this all means and what it looks like, and I'm happy to try to provide you with some answers. So with that, let me see, I'm going to figure out how to share my screen. Start with that. I'm going to start sharing here. And then I'm going to go to slideshow, and I'm going to go from the beginning. All right, can you all see what I'm looking at? You can see the shared screen? Okay. All right, I think I hit the space bar and that makes it work. Yes, okay, great. So I wanted to start off by talking about what a refugee crisis looks like. This is something that I talk about in not just presentations related to climate change, but related to asylum law in general, because it can be hard to tell sometimes what a refugee crisis is and how we perceive it. And usually when I talk about these things, I start by talking about the voyage of St. Louis. I don't know if you are all familiar with this, with the voyage of the St. Louis, this ship, so I'll just give you kind of a brief rundown. You might have heard of it, part of history, very important and very dark, troubling thing that happened with the way that America greeted foreigners coming here. In 1939, 937 passengers boarded a ship, a cruise ship in Hamburg, Germany, and made way to Cuba. That was their destination. Most of them were waiting for visas to the United States to come in, essentially as refugees at that time. But this was a problematic time in the world and a problematic time for immigration. This was after the pogroms had happened, and so there was a lot of forced emigration with an E, so like, people leaving a country, going elsewhere, that was happening out of the area controlled by Germany at the time. And that created conflict. There was an anti-Semitic demonstration in Cuba prior to the arrival of this cruise ship. There were millions of readers following the story, and they were not permitted to enter Cuba. They then traveled northward. They came within basically eyeshot of Miami. There were passengers of the ship that talked about the fact that they could see the lights of Miami from the water where they were awaiting permission to enter the United States. And sadly, they were told no for various reasons. We have a lot of political pressure to look to for the reason at the time. There was political pressure to limit migration. We were just coming out of the Great Depression, so there was concern about protecting American jobs, which probably sounds familiar. There were quotas in place through the regulatory process that limited the number of people that could come. And as you can imagine at that time, in Europe, many people were seeking to leave. There were many people seeking to immigrate, and so the quotas had been reached, and there was no way politically to allow for the exception of this cruise ship full of people. And so it sailed back to Europe. Many of the people that were aboard the St. Louis, in fact, perished in the concentration camps during World War II as a result. Some did not, some got out and were able to live in Great Britain and made it to France and then made their way. But that was not the solution that was available. That seems in hindsight so clear that people should have given them permission to enter due to the crisis that was happening. But it wasn't recognized as a crisis at the time. And so that's the problem. So I just kind of wanted to have that framework for thinking about this as we move through additional information about the climate and refugees today. So the other thing I think that you need to understand about this to kind of really sort of get what is happening right now and where people stand for purposes of seeking asylum on the basis of climate change is what is asylum? Like, what's the actual framework, right? And I promised Sister Cheryl I would not go heavy on the legalese. I would not do a whole bunch of sort of in-depth granular information about how this all works, because believe me, it's extremely confusing and it's taken many, many years. And I'm still like, even though I, probably am considered something of an expert, it's a lot, but I'm not going to try and digest all of that for you right now in the big way. We're going to go with an abridged version. So this is the legal framework for asylum. And I can break it down to 5 things because that's what we do with people when they are seeking admission to the United States, people that are on the migrant journey. We talk about la manita, the 5 things you have to have so that people know and can learn, like popular education, what it is that people need to know about the American asylum process. And the first thing, of course, is you need to know persecution. Like, what are you asking for, right? What are you demonstrating? You're demonstrating that you've been persecuted in the past, that you have a well-founded fear of persecution in the future, either based on experiences that you had or the possibility of problems in the future. That would be demonstrated by things like showing someone else who's similarly situated has been harmed. That's a way that you could show that you yourself are likely to be harmed. And then you have to show why you would suffer that persecution. So you have to show that the conduct that you're going to be, subjected to is something that is persecution, not just discrimination, not, bad names, not problems with people in the community who might just issue idle threats. It has to be actually serious threats to life or freedom in order to qualify as persecution. And then you have to show the why that persecution happened on account of a protected ground. We call that the nexus. There has to be a nexus between the persecution and the reason why you're being persecuted. So you have to show that someone's harming you because you are LGBTQI, because you are of a certain religion, because you have a political opinion, that one of the grounds that are protected by the law actually includes your reason for the harm that you're having. And those grounds are pretty clear. We have persecution. Like, if you think back to the Holocaust, which is really the framework of the entire asylum system, it goes back to 1952 and agreements we had through the UN, international treaty law, that forms the basis. And then you think about the people that were harmed during that system. You think about people that were harmed based on religion, people that were harmed based on their nationality, their political opinion, their race, and then people that were harmed because they were part of a particular social group. And in 1952, when that was created, that was thinking about people that might be LGBTQI, people that might be of a certain family, and just based on your family membership, you could be harmed, right? So it's kind of a squishier group. So those are the reasons that are protected. You have to show that you fit into one of them. Then you have to show that the government is unable or unwilling to allow you to have protection, so that the police are not involved. You were never able to call them for the harm, or you called them and they didn't do anything. And then finally, you have to show where it happened and that it's not reasonable for you to relocate internally, that you cannot move somewhere within your home country, and that you also don't have a safe third country where you might also be allowed to live. Let's say you have a parent who was born, maybe you're in Mexico, but your mom was born in Guatemala. Well, can you just move to Guatemala then and be safe, because you may have a claim for citizenship in that country? So that's kind of the basic sort of framework of how this works. And then I wanted to kind of take you through now, having kind of talked about that, and see what that's like and why someone might need asylum. So with that, I'd like to play this video. Disculpe. Okay. Everybody can still hear me? Is that okay? Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Okay. Somebody had, I think there was something in the chat. I just want to take a pause for a moment and make sure that everybody's okay. If there's supposed to be audio on this video, somebody asked me, did you guys have audio?
No.
No. Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry about that. I did not realize that. But the one thing is that all of the audio was transcribed in the video because everything was in Spanish. So fortunately, hopefully you were okay without the Spanish. But if not, I can definitely put the link to the video in the chat and then you can have it later. I'll include that with the links that I'm going to submit towards the end of the presentation. If that's
Thank
okay.
you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to talk about what happened with Maria, with Teresa. And then I wanted to talk about another family a little bit. And to do that, I kind of wanted to drill down on the general factors that we see when there's migration from the Northern Triangle. To be clear, I have clients from all over the world, right? But we do have a lot of migration from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And historically, for the past few years, that's been the case, right? And there's a lot of factors that people point to. There's a terrific amount of gang-based violence in these countries, gangs that were exported from the United States who essentially operate as a shadow government in these countries such that they're able to make demands of, your everyday community where people have to pay protection money. They have to pay like an impuesto de guerra, they'll say. So basically a war tax where they pay directly to the gangs. And if they don't, they can suffer very grave consequences. They don't have protection from the state in that kind of case. The state is very often corrupt itself in these places where they're either involved in the gangs or otherwise susceptible to bribes. And that goes into the other two big problems, which we see are machismo, and deal with a lot of domestic violence-based claims for protection, because it's very different when you're in a country when you can't just call the police, when you're considered property of your spouse or your parents, and it's possible for them to do whatever they want to you. So we see a lot of problems around that part of the culture. And then economic security is always a problem in countries where there's a lot of sort of disparate economic capacity and ability for people. You have a high poverty rate in places like Guatemala and a lack of ability to be upwardly mobile. And so that's often what, when you go to the border in the US and you're knocking on the door and you're seeking protection and you ask, like, I need to stay here, I can't go home. And we say, well, why? People will say, por mejor vida, like I need to come for a better life. But what does that mean? You know, what would compel somebody to be in a situation where they would leave home? And why is it women and children a lot of the times? Because that's the least mobile group. You have people that are typically staying put, kids, you know, kids in school, people who are maintaining their homes, and yet they flee. So why is that happening? Is it just because everybody wants to get a job and live here? Or is there something else at play? I am of the opinion there's definitely something else at play. There's something rotten in Denmark. We have a problem with really brutal gang-based patriarchal societies that are not permitting people to live and be safe. And additionally, a lot of the insecurity comes about due to events like natural disasters and other sort of man-made events that can affect people. So to think about that, I want to kind of talk about what would have happened in a case if it had come to the US kind of prior to Trump, because everybody wants to know what has happened in the last few years with asylum anyway. So I wanted to make sure to address that. We were already in this very, very protracted fight to establish protections for domestic violence victims in the US, for victims of any sort of family-based violence or gang-based persecution, right? These were things that were not seen by certain parts of the immigration system, certain immigration judges, certain elected officials, people who are appointed through political appointments. They don't see them as necessarily reasons to get asylum because they're of the belief that you should just call the police in your home country and they would solve it the way that they might solve a domestic violence complaint here in the United States. And it took a very long time to get the government to agree that that was not the case and that people deserve protections because society is complicated and they are not all the same. And we were able to do that. And that was kind of where we were. It was this idea of expanding protections to the more sort of squishy realm of what constitutes a particular social group for purposes of getting you asylum, to show that you had that persecution, that past harm on account of your membership in this group, right? Personally, I was dealing with the Atlanta system. So we had a 98% denial rate of asylum under the Obama administration. So before we got to the point that we have the judges that we do now and this nationwide system that has seen a decline in grants of asylum. When I started nationally, the rate was around 50%, and that held up until around 2017 when the rate began to drop based on new precedent, legal decisions and policies and things that were placed by the Trump administration and the officials thereunder in order to create barriers to people receiving asylum. We also had things like the Obama-era family detention sites, which you probably heard about, family detention and then family separation under the Trump years. Those things only kind of got worse. Those were problems that we had then that were created even under the Obama years. Like, we have to admit it, they were done in order to deter people from coming to the United States, to make the situation here so untenable and horrible for people to go through the process of accessing the system that they would just say no. But of course, what we've seen is that people aren't just saying no, because it turns out that if you're going to die, you will do whatever it takes to help you cross a river to get to where the grass is greener and you can feed your children. That's just the way that it works. That's what we do. So we are in a situation where that's how it was before. And now we're post-Trump. I can make this post-Trump sign now. Officially, I think we're done. I think he's no longer going to be involved in this. And we have a really broken court system. The backlog of cases in the immigration court was around 500,000 cases in 2017 at the beginning of it, the beginning of the Trump administration. And we're now at over 1,000,003 cases in the backlog. It takes years for people to process their cases through the removal process, which it's sad that it's called that, but it is, and it often feels very much designed in order to achieve a certain outcome of people being deported at the end. But through a bunch of changes in the regulations, a bunch of precedent decisions that the Attorney General would, they would come out, the court would say, oh, actually, yes, you can get asylum based on being the victim of domestic violence. And then he wouldn't like that. So he would certify that decision to himself and completely change it and say, actually, you can't. So there's just like these decisions out there from the Attorney General that are controlling in the immigration system that can be changed for political reasons over the course of these administrations. Some obviously better thought out than others. This particular set of changes has been catastrophic for people's access to the system. It includes things like making people wait. Instead, it used to be a 6-month wait to receive a work authorization when you apply for asylum. Now you must wait 1 year from when your application is filed just to qualify to apply to ask for authorization to work in the United States. So as you can imagine, when you have someone who's just come out of detention at the border, who has the clothes on their backs and children with them, they're asking how they're going to feed them. And we're at a point where we're having to say, well, you can't legally get work authorization for a year. That's the way the system now works. So I say all that to say that everything that was hard before is now impossible, it feels like, but hopefully getting better. Pretty much every single change that has happened, and there have been over 1,000 immigration system changes over the course of the Trump administration. We were averaging 1 change per day to either the regulations, the policy, the memoranda, the underlying things that were in the purview of the executive branch to control. So we're having to work with all of those. And by work with them, I mean sue the government a whole lot. There's a lot of lawsuits that are still pending over the changes that were made. Hopefully some that will be resolved without damaging people in the near future. And finally, I think that the thing that's happened overall, the thing that I can say even with the idea that there's hope for the future, is that there has been harm to the asylum seeking population. People who were seeking asylum before, the way it's supposed to work is that you knock on the door of the United States, you go to a port of entry and you say, I can't go home because I'm afraid. And they say, well, you don't have documents. So the only thing that you can do here is have a credible fear screening, which is when an officer from the asylum office meets with you. And here's your story to see if you have the kind of base threshold qualities of what you need, those 5 things, the who, what, when, where, why, in order to qualify for asylum, to ask for it. But what began happening was that people are now stuck at the border. They're not permitted to knock on the door. We have this metering process where you have these refugee camps that have sprung up because they're only letting 5 or 10 people in today. They say that they don't have capacity. And as a result, that's why you see all the images of folks that are stuck in, places like Matamoros and places like Tijuana. It is heartbreaking. It is very hard. And we hope that that will end soon. But much like the St. Louis, you're probably going to see in the news a lot of back and forth about whether or not we are creating some kind of migration crisis as a result of being soft on immigration and the idea that people can come here. I would advise you to keep that in mind, to keep the St. Louis in mind when you hear those kinds of conversations, because truly a lot of them go back to the same fears that people always have when you have the idea of the foreigner coming that you're supposed to welcome. That's what happens. So what does a refugee crisis look like? I was going to talk about, I had some kind of questions for the audience. I don't want to make it too much like school, but I did want to kind of ask a couple questions just to give you a heads up. And I wanted it to be based on a comparison. You heard the story of what was going on with Teresa Gomez, the land right defender in Guatemala. And so Hector is someone who came to see me. And I chose to talk about Hector because he's very typical of folks that come to see me. I met him in my office. This was a couple years ago, and he came to see me. He was an indigenous man from Guatemala, from the La Libertad region of Guatemala, so he's Mayan. And I asked him why he left, and he said, I left because I'm poor. My parents are poor. I can't take care of my kids. It's very isolated. I don't have any help from the government. And so I left on a bus hoping to change the lives of my family. Por mi mejor vida. I don't have any problem with crimes or threats or general country violence. I just came and knocked on the door of the United States, and eventually, after waiting, they let me in. I had my child with me, and fortunately we weren't separated. This was a little bit after the family separation stuff, so they were let in together. And I said, I'm sorry, that's not a reason for asylum. What, there's not a basis within that for asylum. So then I said, tell me more. What is happening? Why are you having these problems? What has changed? And he said that his problem is that his corn on his farm grows very small. And it's small because there's a gasoline contamination problem due to a nearby gasoline refinery that's contaminating the land. And so the corn grows tiny and the sheep are sick and have feet covered in chemicals that make them sick. And they also have chickens, but this is only 2 miles from La Libertad. And Perenco, which is a French gasoline company, has this factory. And in Hector's case, they had their community leader speak to the factory, because this is not a new problem. This has been going on for a decade at this point. But things have only gotten worse. The company doesn't do anything and doesn't do anything to help them. And they don't even bother threatening people like Hector, because they just starve them out and build a bigger wall around the factory so that there's no way for people to confront them about what is happening. He said he's a farmer. He's always worked as a farmer to support his family. It's what he knows, but this has become impossible. He can't relocate. He doesn't have the money. He's an indigenous man. They have a lot of discrimination in Guatemala against Mayans. He had to leave his wife behind with a couple of the kids and the animals to take care of them. And the children are all having these allergic reactions, coughs, a gripe. And his parents have bronchitis and other respiratory problems as a result of what's going on. But the government remains unconcerned in Guatemala. There's no protection for them. So he's feeling stressed out because he has 3 children, his wife's mother, his own parents, all working on this farm. And this is all they can do. There's not somewhere else they can go. They're very limited. But I asked him if anybody had ever called the police, and he said no. And what would happen if you called the police? Well, not much. Have you ever publicly been involved in any sort of action to try to seek a change in what is happening? And he also said no. And I want to know at this point, does anybody have an idea of what the difference between a case like Hector's is with a case like Teresa, who is also seeking asylum in the United States at this moment? Does anybody want to put a hand up or have a thought about it? I could just tell you, but I just wanted to see if anybody's got thoughts. And I can't see everybody because I've got you in this mode. I'm going to treat it as a rhetorical question, so you can all unmute yourselves. Feel free at any point. Okay. Going once, going twice. Anyone? No? Okay. All right. So the difference here, of course, is that Teresa's claim that she has for asylum is not based on climate change. Her claim is based on the fact that she publicly expressed a political opinion, which is one of those 5 protected grounds. Unfortunately, Hector has never expressed a public opinion. He's never been associated with any sort of movement whereby he has experienced persecution in the past on that basis. He has this belief that it's wrong, but it's very difficult at this point for somebody like that, someone who is a farmer, a good man, who's providing and doing everything he can for his family to take care of them, with the ability to seek protection from the US government for what was happening there. I think if you think about it in relation to things like the St. Louis and what was happening, you can think about that with the pressure of globalism, with the idea that you do have companies that are refining minerals, that are doing different things in these countries and are capable of going in and doing whatever they want, essentially, because these countries permit them to, due to the fact that governments are often unstable, often due to US involvement, and due to the fact that people are poor and don't have a voice and can't advocate for themselves, and because they are marginalized in general. So I say that because I think it's indicative of what is happening, which is that we do have a migrant crisis that is somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat based in climate change, even at this point, and with the things that cause climate change, such as mineral exploration and other forms of things like gas refineries, such as in Hector's case. And there's not a good system of protections for folks like Hector in this legal framework that we have right now. But yet, I took this picture, I wanted to share it because it makes me happy. It says, El sol brilla para todos, the sun shines for everybody. That's a picture from Tijuana. It was the day after migrants had been gassed at the border in Tijuana. It was the day I got there in late 2018 during the refugee crisis because of the caravans. And this was the response to the people the day after they had been gassed. So the question is then, what do we do? How do we address all of this? In 2018, the World Bank estimated that Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia are going to generate around 143 million climate refugees by 2050. And I feel that's a very depressing statistic, but it's something that we do have to pay attention to. It's a very hard, big truth. It's absolutely an elephant in the room. And this is according to the Brookings Institute. In 2017, 68.5 million people were forcibly displaced, more than any point in human history, for many reasons. It's difficult to estimate, but approximately 1/3 of them were moved due to sudden onset weather events, things like flooding, forest fires after droughts, intensified storms. And while the remaining 2/3 of the people that migrated, those displacements, are the results of other humanitarian crises, it's really obvious that climate change is affecting migration, right? We have all of this proof. We have storms that happened in, again, the same place. The Northern Triangle was hit very badly by a couple of hurricanes just in the course of the last year that caused an onset of migration. And this is a situation where we're not able to prove that migration, that climate change is the sole factor for migration in most cases. There's really a very few clear examples of that yet. The Pacific Islands include islands where, of course, the sea level has risen to a point that they're no longer inhabitable. And so in 2015, the Teota, I always mispronounce it, the Teota family were the first family to apply for refugee status in New Zealand based on Kiribati, which is the island nation they lived on, disappearing. And it was the very first request for asylum based explicitly on climate change, but the High Court of New Zealand ultimately dismissed that claim. Islands in the Federated States of Micronesia have also been greatly reduced just in their landmass, and are now, some of them have been washed down to an uninhabitable state, and they have a problem of freshwater contamination due to seawater, the things that you would expect to happen in those cases. But they don't get much attention in the media. And we are dealing with this crisis through things like sea levels rising, but then also extreme heat. You can expect for more of that to lead to migration, especially as our demand for energy grows. That continues to grow, even with the predictions. Right now, the current track we're on to expect an increase of about 66% growth until 2040 for purposes of expansion of the drivers of climate change, the rapid economic growth and urbanization. And so we're in a situation where a lot of countries need to do a lot of work in order to create protections for people. The current protections we have aren't great. We have the UN High Commission for Refugees, which is the commission that works with people who are seeking protection from, a country. You go and you register with them when you get to a foreign country and say, I can no longer return to where I'm from. It's the place from which the definition of asylum comes. It's a place where you would immediately, hope to go for help. But as we've seen, the framework that we use in America, which is the same framework that's used through the UNHCR and our declarations on human rights, those don't apply to people who are strictly climate refugees at this point, because your persecution isn't based on one of the grounds protected by those laws, by those treaties. We have other programs that I'm very hopeful that with Biden in office, that we will see an expansion of them. We have temporary protected status, which is a program that can be enacted after a natural disaster or if there's civil unrest. Then Congress is authorized to issue temporary protected status to nationals of a country that has been affected. Right now, we actually have temporary protected status for individuals from Honduras and El Salvador based on a hurricane that happened, and the fact that they were not able to safely return in the aftermath of the hurricane. But the thing is that hurricane was Hurricane Mitch, which took place for El Salvador took place in 2000. It was in 2000 actually, because 2001 is when they began to get it. In Honduras, it was the year before for the earthquake. So in 1999, they granted them TPS, which meant you had to be physically in the United States at the time in order to qualify. So that doesn't really help anybody who's showed up in the intervening 20 years. However, Congress could always designate these countries for TPS so that people who've come in subsequent to other disasters could qualify. And that's something that we have repeatedly asked for protections for people from Guatemala, once again, Honduras and El Salvador, due to the fact that they've had hurricanes in the last year that have just been devastating to large areas of the community there. So those are things that the government could do and actions that we're urging them to take. There's also deferred enforcement of departure, which if you pay a lot of attention to immigration news, you might have heard about this. It was in the news because of Venezuelans recently. The day before he left office, President Trump issued deferred enforcement of departure for Venezuelans. And it seemed like it was in a political bid to make people in Miami happy, but it was also something that they desperately need in Venezuela due to the fact that the government is experiencing such civil unrest and there's wide-scale starvation, in addition to other problems that they've experienced. So those programs exist, and there are programs that require political pressure usually to levy and push for them to be enacted in a way that protects certain classes of people, but they're not a universal solution, right? So otherwise, we're talking about wide-scale political pressure for change. That's the final thing that it really comes down to, which sounds nice and pat, and I fit it into 3 words on that bullet point, but of course it is the most complicated thing out there to do, because it's like conducting an orchestra to get them to move on anything. In my career, I've only been able to get Congress to move once on something, and it was due to the forced medical procedures that were happening to the women in Irwin County Detention Center. We were able to get a resolution through Congress, but it still took a month, and it took basically hitting every single button that you could at the same time to pull all of that about, between media pressure, advocacy, grassroots organizing, getting all of the facts, investigating, and then putting forth something that caused such pressure that we could get the Speaker of the House to get out of the way and let us bring that to the floor in the middle of like a budget vote, right? That's not going to happen every time. And it doesn't happen, especially in situations that are so huge and yet so quiet, right? You don't really hear about this as a problem because it's so abstract. So in order to increase political pressure and have change, I think that what we really have to do is continue to document things. That's what I, as an attorney, can do. I can continue to show when there's problems, when there's cases like this, to show the outcomes. And then, of course, thank you to all of our climate scientists and researchers and folks that do country analysis and are experts on conditions, political and otherwise, in these countries, because they're able to help us document what is happening in order to show the government the dire consequences of inaction. And so I think that kind of feeds into this slide as well, but the idea of what we can do to document it is the kind of stuff that the ground level foot soldiers like I can do, right? And that's how we create case precedent, because what we have to do is undo some of the more troubling regulations and cases that happened through the course of the last several years. But then we also need new precedent that actually represents and recognizes what is going on regarding climate change. We're going to have to do something about this crisis in the next couple decades. It's absolutely going to be a problem. And that also begs the question of statutory and regulatory changes, right? To get statutory changes, we have to have agreements in Congress. We haven't been able to get them to agree on what to have breakfast for most of my career. I've been hoping for immigration reform since I became an immigration attorney in 2007, but it hasn't happened yet. And I'm not super hopeful about statutory changes, even in this day and age, even with the bodies of government all being controlled by one party. I don't think that they will be able to pull that off. And I don't think that they think that they will be able to pull it off either, based on conversations that have happened between my advocacy network and the transition team, and elected officials as well, people that we've met with. Regulatory changes could allow for this sort of expansion where the underlying sort of guts of the handbook of how the government works, like that kind of stuff, that can be changed, but it's complicated, it's time consuming, and it involves a lot of notice and comment periods and often leads to sort of middling results. The international community, of course, is aware of this. It's a global problem. And so the international legal framework, as I talked about earlier, what we have for our asylum law, which is reflected in the international framework, doesn't recognize this yet, but that's an area that needs work. So groups like the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, groups like the UN, do have to address this, and they are in the process of addressing it, but it's never really a front burner issue, I think, is the problem. This always gets backburnered compared to other more immediate crises that people have. And then finally, I would say that, advocacy and grassroots organizing are just such essential tools. That's really what brings things to the forefront a lot of the time, because without that, without people, writing letters, showing up, talking about what's going on, it's very hard to direct these other groups, the government, political actors, the international human rights framework, all of these actors to have change. It really does come from the people. So I would say that that's an essential piece of what we're seeing and what we're doing. So I guess with that, do you have any questions? I feel like this has been kind of a bummer. I'm sorry that it's made you sad, but it's not very hopeful. It is, despite the fact that this is a difficult fight and a difficult time. I like to think that there are people who are fighting the good fight and working on these problems and, showing the change in sea levels, showing the inability of people to receive redress from their governments when you have multinational corporations that, own more property than those governments and have more control. But it really, I think, comes down to all of us to do our part. And so I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move us all back to the regular format. But here we go. Okay, and so I see there's a question from Amy. Are there specific political actions you encourage people like us to take? Ooh, I can't think of any that are like right off the top of my head, right? There are definitely sign-on campaigns for a lot of these issues that as they come up, which are kind of more immediate, urgent, like as issues are being addressed. I think awareness is the first step, and being able to focus on them. The actions that you can take when they do come up, I think, signing on to petitions. It's also always a great idea to call your member of Congress. If you've never done that before, I highly, highly encourage you to do so. It takes 5 minutes. It's very, very easy to do. Calling them in the office in Washington, like if you call the office of your elected representative in Washington, that's one thing, but calling from in your district actually matters a lot more. So if you are in district and you are calling the local district office of your elected representative, they don't get that many calls. So if a bunch of people call on the same issue, it might just take 5 or 10. That's the kind of thing that then gets raised to the attention of people up the chain. It's like, okay, well, these are our constituents and this is what their concern is. So figuring out who's in your networks and who you can target that might be helpful on particular legislation. If you see things come up, then that's a step that I would recommend taking, definitely. Who else? Pressure on some of these gas and chemical companies. I agree that there should be pressure on them. I have a lot of hope in renewable energy. I think that that's putting pressure on them. I don't know if you guys noticed, but one piece of good news that I thought was good about climate change and those that cause it was the fact that Exxon slid off of the Dow Jones Industrial because they are no longer one of the top 50 companies because they've lost so much money. I think that we are at a point where green jobs and renewable sources of energy are going to really supplant the income of companies that work on non-renewable resources. So hopefully they will lose power via the loss of their market share. Definitely, if you haven't thought about divestment as a strategy, if you have group and collective bargaining power, I don't know if you have a situation where your pensions are invested in the market, but quite often it's a good idea to ask if there are opportunities for investment funds that are green, right? So that's something that I've asked about at all the jobs that I've had. I recommend that you ask, because even though it's not asking for direction on specific stocks to purchase, which you're not supposed to do in a retirement program, it is possible to ask for programs that don't include non-renewable energy sources, or in my case, I don't want to invest in any company that's involved in private prisons because a couple of them are traded on the market, and I don't want any Vanguard stock because it's usually mixed into their index fund. So I would say divestment is a strategy that's strong and worth looking at. It can be a little bit tricky because it's hard to know what's in your index funds. It's such a kind of large, amount of different companies that are filtered in together. But to at least ask those questions, because if you don't, then I can guarantee your broker is not. I can guarantee whoever is working with you through your retirement program, if it's affiliated with your employer, it's not likely that they care. It's just so normal to see, like, okay, well, Exxon, GE, those companies are great, right? They're going to take good care of us, but that's not necessarily the case. So I would say to think about that as an action. As Carol says, in St. Louis, the Interfaith Committee on Latin America addresses immigration issues, but how can we make them aware of the situation of climate refugees from the Northern Triangle? I think that you can ask them. I will bet you that they're probably already aware, right? I'm going to guess, like the Catholic Legal Immigration Network and Interfaith, like they are seeing a lot of the same things that I am usually, because I tend to do a lot of pro bono work and do a lot of referrals through Catholic Charities. And so I would say that they're probably aware, but they may have other opportunities for you on this basis. If they're not, if they have questions about it, then I'm happy to connect people, but it might be a good idea for them to have programming and then work on, training the community more broadly regarding these issues. That's what I would say. Anybody else? Other questions? There's a question up. Is it Bernadette? Is it your hand up? Or are you touching? No, okay, all right. Okay.
Here's one question. It says, have you reached out to Network? They have a large audience, Nuns on the Bus.
I'm not familiar with Network. Is that me?
Okay.
Can anybody give me the context?
Renita, can you say a little bit about Network? Still muted.
Yeah. Renee's unmuted. You're unmuted. Bardenheimer, P. Bardenheimer. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the one that put that question up there to you, Sarah. Network is based in Washington, and they've got a full staff that kind of deals with almost all issues. And they do send out to us things that we can try to help to vote for, so it'd be a nice source for you to push some of your legislation, try to get your legislation through.
Absolutely. That sounds like Immigrants List is the political action committee that I'm on the board of, and their whole gig is to try to promote candidates for elected office who are pro-humane, fair, and sensible immigration reform. And so very often I'll get information about bills through them because of things that are being considered. So they'll get passed by members of Congress to our group in order to review them and make sure that they're sensible and good and actually helpful, or see if there's any tweaks in the language. It sounds like Network probably is kind of in the same realm as far as getting legislation, thinking about it, and then having a public opinion on it. So I would say that that's a good source to look at. If they're not looking directly specifically at this issue, then asking for them to do so, I think, is great. The problem is that there's just not, like, on this specific issue, the point that we're at is more about showing that there's not protection than that there is. I think strategically we're having to show that cases are going to go into court. And someone like Teresa, who we had the video about, she can totally win a case. She can win a case based on her publicly expressed political opinion for which she's directly experienced harm. She's not my client, but I would love to have that case. That would be a great one to have. But if you have somebody who's more like Hector, who was not able to get into the realm of being a land defender, because that's 20 people, 30 people who are the leaders, who are immediately sticking their necks out and suffering these consequences, it's a lot more difficult to make those arguments. And so what we're going to have to see most likely is several of those arguments go up through the court system and fail before there's any real need for change, because you have to show that something is broken and not working generally before they're going to do anything to fix it. So that's the part that I'm going to keep hammering on, is trying to put these cases through and prepare them as well as possible, so that when they go up and are decided on appeal, that the denials will be for the right reasons that need to be changed, as opposed to the wrong ones for which I was just wrong. So that's what we're trying to do, and that's how that works. Yeah. More questions? Anybody?
Okay. Can you explain the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker?
That's a great question. Yes, I can. So a refugee is someone who has left their country and they're seeking to go to a new country. And they've designated themselves a refugee through the UN, to the UN High Commission for Refugees. You actually go and you register with them. You explain to them the reasons why you can't go home, and they put this whole process in motion to check your background and evaluate you and see if you are in fact a refugee, and then put you through the placement process if you're successful. So refugees wait typically about 2 years. They go through really extensive background checks, and then they don't have control over where they're placed. It's just wherever, the country that has the capacity to take them is putting their hand up, essentially. So we have refugee quotas in the United States. We have caps. It used to, actually, I don't even remember the pre-Trump numbers. I want to say we were at 85,000, I want to say, was it? It's hard to remember, but he dropped us down to about 15,000 refugee admissions per year, and then was admitting less than half of that. I have friends that work for, the programs like the New American Project, New American Pathways, who had no clients for like a year because they just shut it all down. But that's the way it works. It's for people that are coming in, that have been in refugee sites and gone through that process, right? Asylees, they don't get asylum outside the United States. So you're here already, and then you apply for asylum from inside the borders of the United States and say you're seeking asylum. That process is done domestically through the Department of Homeland Security. So you meet with an asylum officer and review your application, and if you're approved, then they do all the background checks and all of those things, but it's a process that's done affirmatively, and you get your asylum status, and then after a year you can get a green card, and then you're on the way to becoming a citizen eventually in many years. If you don't get granted asylum by the asylum office, or if you come into the country without inspection, right? You're at the border and you don't have papers, you're caught at that point, then you are put into removal proceedings where we're trying to kick you out. But if you have a credible fear of being returned to your country of origin, you can say to that officer that's trying to remove you, I'm afraid, and then they have to interview you. They're supposed to interview you about why you're afraid. And if it fits into that asylum framework, then you do have an opportunity to at least present your asylum claim to an immigration judge, which is a lot harder prospect. The chances of getting granted affirmatively when it's just, like a person talking to an officer and then it's, there's no conflict, like that's much better. But if it's, me on one side, opposing counsel on the other, and then a judge who's going to decide in the middle, then your chances of success because of that triangle and an oppositional force are a lot lower. That's just how it works in general. And then particularly in certain jurisdictions like Atlanta with such low grant rates. So does that explain it? Follow-up questions? Okay. Additional questions, anything else? I wanted to give you guys some links. Let's see, I thought just in general, if you haven't read them, there's this piece from the New York Times that came out, it was last year, that I thought was really great. It's not specifically about asylum, but about climate-based migration. And it's a good interactive piece that they did. And I thought that was very helpful to kind of visualize what we're talking about when you think about global warming and migration due to, immediate emergent natural disasters, those sorts of things. Sister Rosemary, Charlotte immigration courts also have low approval numbers. You are completely correct about that. I take cases in the Charlotte immigration court too, and I'm familiar with them. That's part of the same funky ecosystem we have here, actually, because they were controlled by that court was created as an offshoot of the Atlanta court. We used to do all the cases for North and South Carolina out of the Atlanta court too. And all those judges got trained and all this trial counsel got trained by the Atlanta court. Most of our people in Atlanta moved up to Washington to work in the last 4 years. So they're kind of all in headquarters, but several of them are looking for new jobs today, which is, not the worst thing in the world.
I'll interrupt, and if I can, Sarah.
Please.
One of the things I was participating in, I actually do live in Charlotte, not St. Louis, but I'm temporarily here. But we did a court observation with a group in order to see if we could figure, if the group of lawyers that started that wanted to figure out if we could somehow contest some of the ways that it was low by how the judges were acting or not acting. And so they trained us to go in, and I'd sit there for 4 hours and take notes and turn it in and see what could happen.
That's wonderful.
Because the rates were really were low there.
They are, and I know some of the folks in that court and in both the Carolinas that are working on that problem. We may actually know people in common if that's the case, just because that back before the 2016 election, my whole thing that I was working on was trying to make Atlanta and Charlotte and other terrible courts that have these sort of asylum-free zones, these jurisdictions where you can't seem to get a case granted, was trying to fix them. So in December of 2016, right after the election, I was in DC at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, arguing with my friend Detenis Barola, who now works for the American Immigration Council, but was with Piedmont Legal Services in North Carolina, about, yes, you may know her. We were arguing about basically how these zones don't grant asylum, and that the disparate grant rate is enough that the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights should investigate just on that basis. Our argument probably holds less water now, because in the intervening 4 years, of course, the asylum grant rate nationwide has declined such that perhaps our rates are more in line with other places. But yeah, they do. Like, Charlotte's been problematic since the beginning, since it was founded in like 2011. So yeah.
We were told, however, that even though we didn't get a lot of change, then COVID happened, that at least the judges started being more polite, giving better instructions for follow-up to the people there, being more cautious, at least in making sure they had translation and all the different kinds of things like that. So it did improve, at least to a tiny bit, maybe.
I would say if you have the capacity to do court observation, that is super meaningful in our world. And one of the things that we were all working on prior to this was to create an app so that you'd be able to go on your phone. And if you were, in court taking notes on something, you could upload those notes and it would go into the system where all of the data could be aggregated and compared. To see like when judges had specific problems like not using interpreters or not providing appropriate advisals to people. It's one thing for me to see it because I'm an attorney, I'm a defense attorney, and I'm used to them pulling that kind of stuff. And so my whole job is to say, no, you can't do that. That's not how this works. And argue with them. But the thing is, of course, that, I say, of course, but maybe you don't know this, although I'm guessing Sister Rosemary, you probably do. A lot of people are not represented in removal proceedings. When you're being deported from the United States, you do have the right to an attorney because that's a right under Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, but you do not have the right to counsel appointed and paid for by the government. It's not the same as a criminal proceeding in which your Fifth Amendment right to counsel means that you have somebody no matter what. Because it's a civil proceeding that people are in, even though it's death penalty consequences in a traffic court setting, people do not automatically get an attorney provided to them. That is something that absolutely needs to change. It's a huge change. There should be universal representation. But if you can imagine someone who is not a native English speaker, who may not have access to an interpreter, being told that, okay, well, you have 14 days to submit this application. If everything has to be in English, all your documents must be translated. And this is a court system at this point where if you don't check, you don't put NA for every place that you're going to leave blank because it's not applicable to you, they'll reject your application. Those are the kinds of very sort of just bureaucratic red tape solutions that people like Stephen Miller had in order to make it as difficult as possible to access the system. So observing, seeing when that kind of stuff happens is very helpful because a lot of it happens, again, in a black hole. If there's no one observing, if there's not immigration attorneys in court because people don't have representation or there's not community advocates, organizers there, it's just impossible to know. And that's what keeps me up at night is all the cases we don't know about because they have these cattle call master calendars where there could be 50 people getting ordered removed at the same time. And occasionally you'll talk to somebody afterwards and go, yeah, I have a hearing coming up. I saw a judge on TV. So I think I understand how it works. It was like, that was your court hearing. That was the judge. Like, you have a deportation order now. We have to figure out how to undo this because people just don't get appropriate advice. So it's not a humane system and it's something we have to fix. But thank you for going and doing that, Sister Rosemary. And I do think that that's a great opportunity. Kind of pre-pandemic, we were in the process of rolling it out. It's hard. I don't really have anywhere to direct you on that right now, but if I do get information on the tech tools as the pandemic ends, then that might be something I can share with Sister Cheryl to share with all of y'all if it's something you're interested in doing. Just because of the pandemic, it's impossible, no one can go into court right now. So you can't really go and observe things. And the online cases, they don't really have, they're doing some cases through televideo, but there's no public access to those hearings at this time. So it's happening in the dark. Yeah. More questions? I was gonna give you one other link, which is, just feel like I'm giving you a lot of reading to do, but there's a good piece on Honduras. It's a longer report, but just if you have any interest, I think Global Witness is a good organization, nonprofit that sort of studies things like climate change. And their particular focus in that article was on Honduran land defenders. So Teresa, who we saw in the video, is from Guatemala, but again, it's a problem in lots of countries in Central America. Especially where corporate interests are sort of supplanting the rights of the everyday citizen. So that's a good one to know about.
Wow.
Any more? Anything else?
Well, Sarah, we really appreciate all the information you have given us.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming. It's shocking. It's something I didn't really know. And I really appreciate everything, and I hope everybody can give you an applause or a thumbs up or a just love all the work that you're doing and hope that you really love what you're doing and continue for many, many years to come.
I don't have it. This is what I do. So I don't know what else I'm going to do. I really do love this area of the law. I'm looking forward to it, hopefully being happier in the coming years. I can't think of another thing I could do for people that matters more that I can do. Like if I can reunite someone's family or make sure that they are safe and have a way to grow and do all the things that, you know, people need to do to be safe and happy, then that's very satisfactory. So those are the good days, and I hope that there will be more of them to come.
I think your sharing on Facebook is what encouraged me to contact you when you shared some of your successes.
I apologize for all my swear words. I'm sorry about that. There's a lot of cursing that happens in the midst of this too. Get mad at people a lot, but it's okay. I'm not going anywhere. And the good thing is that the rest of the community is as dedicated as I am. And there's a really, like, I found a lot of strength in the people who are my friends and colleagues through the course of everything the last 4 years, but particularly even the pandemic. It's been very, very heartwarming. And yeah, I'm still smiling and happy as long as we
That's good.
create change. That's the idea. The
I
good
think
kinds.
somebody has put a question in the chat.
Yeah,
Says, has Biden issued any changes in immigration regulations?
great question. Sort of. He has announced, we've had several executive orders, which a lot of what President Trump did was governing by his executive authority, because again, we can't get Congress to agree on anything right now. So it has to be done through the auspices of what the president can control. So we've had a series of orders, but the thing is that they came out and everyone was really excited, but mostly what they said is that we're going to make a task force to study a thing. They didn't actually say we're going to fix the thing. We're going to make a task force to talk about doing a thing, which people in my line of work found very frustrating, because Lucas Gutentag, professor at Stanford, has spent the last 4 years chronicling every single change with, you know, committees of students and everything you'd have to do to change them back and fix them or make things better. And we spent the entirety of December and January talking to the transition team and having all of these meetings. A couple of the orgs that I'm with went and we all had these calls and all these things, and we told them everything that needed to happen. They took good notes, and now they're saying that it's time to do a task force and study things. So we found that lacking, because we gave them everything that they needed, and the people that they hired, a lot of them are people that, you know, we worked with. They're our colleagues. So we know that they know. So it feels like there's a little bit of biding time that's happening right now. And I hope that that means that there's going to be some really bold, great initiatives as soon as we're done with the mess that was on television today. However, I can't say for certain that that's the case. And since I can't, then I'll continue to plan like it's not. Like maybe that, you know, maybe I'm waiting for Godot there, but I'm not going to wait that long. I'm going to do what I have to do, try and make changes. So we'll see. There will be things that will make it better. There will be things where prosecutorial discretion is being returned, so they won't just deport every single person that they encounter. But that is, it's a mixed bag, because if you're in a jurisdiction like Georgia, if you're somewhere like Louisiana, even Missouri, like you wind up in places that are more prone to make their money off of incarcerating people. They tend to also be more restrictionist in immigration issues. That's what I've seen, because they'd rather lock people up, because that's how small municipalities tend to make their money, is by getting money from the state or from the federal government to house people who are, you know, previously were all detained for criminal cases, but now for immigration cases. Biden announced that the DOJ would stop using private immigration or private detention centers, for example, right? So but that's for criminal cases. Immigration is civil, and it's not controlled by the Department of Justice. The immigration detention is controlled by the Department of Homeland Security, and 80% of the contracts to private prison detention centers are for immigration cases. So those facilities won't go anywhere based on that announcement that he had. So we have to keep pushing, and there's other ways, things that we're doing to try and kill those contracts. A lot of litigation around the COVID conditions, the fact that you can't safely confine somebody in detention right now. And there's just a lot of different things to push on. One thing I can definitely say is that I'm never bored. I'm never bored of this line of work. I'm mad a lot, but I'm never wondering what else to do with my time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that Biden has a lot of people in the immigration services that don't agree with loosening up immigration. And there's a huge buildup along the border, and not, in order to start processing those people. I'm not sure that a lot of the immigration officials really want to.
I 100%.
I may be being cynical.
No, I think that's realistic. I think based on the folks that got promoted under this administration or hired, like new hires and people that made their way up through the system, were folks that wanted to toe the line with a really sort of enforcement minded way of doing things, where the idea was to make it as efficient as possible to deport as many pieces of people as possible, as quickly as possible. That was the idea. And so, yeah, I'm not hopeful for a place like Atlanta. Like, I see that the executive order that he came out with said there would be, more discretion, and unless somebody is like a terrorist or, a violent felon, we're not going to move to deport people. Like, unless, like if they've been here for a long time, why would you do that? Right. But I don't think that will play the same way in Atlanta that it does in San Francisco. It's just not going to, because people here are going to go, well, oh, we've got, there's 4 detention centers in Georgia now, and we're supposed to fill up those beds. That's what our buddies we made the contract with wanted. Louisiana, when I began practicing immigration law, had 1 detention center for immigration. And in the last 2 years, they are now at, I think, 16. That all, and the other ones all opened up just in the last few years. And it's because they had criminal justice reform. If you want to talk about like ecosystem and connection, there was criminal justice reform in Louisiana. They lost about 1/3 of their prisoners. And because they lost all these prisoners, they could no longer make money. We had these little jurisdictions that were all just kind of starving. And so they got in bed with ICE, and ICE said, okay, we'll give you money and we'll pay you 3 times as much per day for a civil detainee that you would get for a criminal detainee. So all these little towns said, great, that's a wonderful idea, we'll take it. But now they're treating people who are confined to detention for civil immigration purposes the same as they would somebody who was previously treated terribly and detained for criminal reasons, and in fact, sometimes worse. Plus there's no interpreters often. So that's part of the system that has to be reformed too. And I think a lot of it has to do with just getting money out of the system. Like, I don't know a perfect solution for how to do that, but if you think back to it the same way that, PEMCO or whoever is a problem because they're a multinational corporation who can just build a bigger fence around their building and not even have to worry about murdering the land defenders that protest. We have the same problem with Core Civic and Geo Group and LaSalle. Like, those are companies that derive a lot of income because of the fact that they are able to not pay people and make them do the work, the fact that they are able to not provide adequate medical care, the fact that they pay low wages in rural areas where people don't have a lot of other opportunity to work. But that's a part of our environment here in the US to fix. So that's, it's another thing to think about, but it definitely contributes to the overall sort of global set of problems of how we are supposed to grapple with welcoming the stranger and providing refuge when that is our calling, and that's what we should do, and that's what, as Americans, we hold ourselves out to be capable of.
Well, again, Sarah, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for your knowledge and your passion. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad that you called me. I hope it is, again, not too depressing, because it is fairly sad, but it's also a thing that's you definitely can fight against, right? And that, I don't know, to me, that feels good. Like, it feels good to know that there's something that we can do to affect change and keep working and fighting.
Yes, 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 yes.
Thank you all. I'm going to throw my email into the comments so that in case anybody has any more questions in the future, you can get in touch with me.
That's great. That's great.
There you go.
I want to remind everybody that next month Our FFE event is on March 9th. It will be Joshua Holtz, another speaker, and he will speak about violence in the supply chain. And it sounds very interesting. Before that, we will also be having a 3-night discussion on Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti. Our sister Georgette will lead that presentation and discussion. Those dates are February 18th, February 25th, and March 4th. You can check out all these events on our website, www.fsolph.org, under the events tab to register there. So we hope to see many of you again on other of our upcoming events, whether it's on Fratelli Tutti, our other speakers, our films in our Franciscans for Earth series, and even our paving paths that happens on March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. Sister Renee, do you want to say a little bit about our paving paths topic?
Yes, we started the Paving Paths program a number of years ago to pave paths of peace. And we take an incident in Francis's life and we apply it to today. So our theme that we're going to be doing at the further into March is looking at how do we encounter others who we identify as them? And it will be based on Francis's experience with the Sultan and how Francis perceived his relationship with the Muslims, and that's so applicable today. So our learned prejudices and that program will be what can we learn about encountering them, changing our attitudes.
Thank you, Sister Renita. And I thank everybody for participating this evening, for listening in. And we hope that you come back for another event or speaker in the future. And again, we thank Sarah so much for her presentation this evening. I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you all so much. Have a lovely night. It was great to be here. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.